Welcome back to the channel. Sometimes, history leaves behind quiet shadows, stories that sit just at the edge of memory. Not fully forgotten, but never fully understood. Tonight, we are stepping into one of those shadows. A case that began in the heart of San Francisco in the mid-1970s, during a time when the city was alive with music, art, new ideas, and a search for freedom. Yet beneath that vibrant energy, there were also stories that went unspoken, and fears that were rarely shared out loud. Welcome back, everyone. In today's story, we will revisit a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. It is a case involving a man the press later called the Doodler, a name that came from a simple, quiet detail. He was known to sketch portraits of the people he met. Not threatening, not aggressive, just sketching. And yet, behind those drawings, behind late-night conversations and a seemingly gentle facade, there was something darker, something that left investigators puzzled for decades. San Francisco in the 1970s was a place undergoing change, socially, culturally, and politically. The city was becoming a home for those searching for acceptance, especially within the LGBTQ+ community. It was a place where many hoped they could finally live openly, or at least more freely than in other parts of the country. Yet acceptance was not universal, and fear followed many into their daily lives. For some, simply being seen with the wrong person, in the wrong place, or at the wrong time, could carry risks not only socially, but legally and personally. It was within this atmosphere that the Doodler appeared. Witnesses and surviving individuals later described him as calm, soft-spoken, and artistic. Someone who would sit with a pencil in hand, drawing the face of the person sitting across from him. The gesture felt personal, human, even kind. And that might be why so few realized what was happening until it was too late. The case, as we know it today, is built from fragments, brief encounters, second-hand recollections, and interviews that have surfaced slowly, often difficult to verify. Investigators identified patterns, locations, behavior, shared details among those who crossed paths with the man. But the larger story remained frustratingly out of reach. And one of the most striking parts of this story is not only the mystery itself, but the silence surrounding it. At the time, many people who may have held key information chose not to speak. Not because they did not care, but because speaking out could have exposed aspects of their personal lives that society was not yet willing to accept or protect. Their silence was shaped by fear of judgment, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing everything. As we move further into this story, we will look at what we know, what remains uncertain, and how changing times may finally offer new paths toward answers. The name, the Doodler, was not given by the public at first. It emerged later after investigators noticed a detail that appeared again and again in survivor statements. Before anything else happened, before conversations turned personal, before trust was created or broken, there was the drawing. Witnesses described a man who carried a small sketchbook. He was not loud or forceful. Instead, he seemed thoughtful, almost shy. He would sit down beside someone in a cafe, a bar, or a quiet corner of the city, and simply ask if he could sketch them. And in that small gesture, there was a sense of connection, the kind of quiet attention that makes a person feel seen. There is something intimate about being drawn. You hold still. You allow someone to study the curve of your face, the way your eyes settle, the shape of your mouth when you are relaxed. It requires patience. It creates a moment where two people are present with one another, without distraction. And back then, in the 1970s, before phones and instant photos, a hand-drawn portrait could feel personal, almost special. Survivors later recalled how the experience seemed gentle, even pleasant. The Doodler did not raise concern. He did not give the impression of danger. He was not a stereotype of anything to fear. He was simply there, creative, soft-spoken, attentive. It is this contrast that has made the case so haunting. The line between trust and harm was thin, invisible, and unsuspecting. The drawing itself became a symbol, a gateway, a moment in time where a choice seemed ordinary, but carried consequences no one foresaw. Investigators believe that it was through these sketches that he built familiarity. The drawing allowed time to talk, to observe, to learn about the person sitting before him. It was an invitation, and one that many accepted without hesitation. This detail, the sketchbook, became the piece that tied the story together. It gave the case its name. And yet, ironically, the sketches themselves have never been found. No physical sketchbook was ever recovered. No portraits were collected. The memory of the drawings lives only in the recollections of those who survived, and in the stories passed through investigators who worked the case. And that leads to a quiet, unsettling truth. Sometimes, what remains in a mystery is not just the evidence that was lost, but the human moments that were shared along the way. The conversations, the trust, the time someone spent looking directly into another's eyes, believing they were safe. When we look at the name the Doodler, we are reminded of how ordinary an interaction can seem, even when something hidden is unfolding underneath. To understand why this case became so difficult to solve, we have to step back and look at the world as it was in the mid-1970s. San Francisco was becoming a refuge for many who wanted to live more openly, especially within the LGBTQ+ community. But even in a city known for its progress, acceptance was not guaranteed. Public judgment, misunderstanding, and discrimination were still widespread. Being open about one's identity could affect a job, a family relationship, and even personal safety. This reality shaped how people interacted, who they trusted, and what they felt safe sharing. When investigators first began looking into the case, they quickly found themselves facing a silence that was not based on indifference, but on fear. Several individuals who had encountered the person later called the Doodler chose not to testify or speak publicly. Some had believed they were simply meeting someone new in what was meant to be a private part of their lives. Coming forward could have meant bringing extremely personal details into the public eye, details that, at that time, could have changed everything for them. Some survivors were willing to speak privately, but not in court. The risk was too high. Many feared that, in seeking justice, they would expose themselves to scrutiny or judgment. Their privacy was deeply tied to their safety, and so silence became protection. This silence was not a failure. It was a reflection of the social environment of the era, and it is one of the main reasons why the case stalled early on. Investigators understood the situation, but without the ability to use key witness testimony, the path forward narrowed. The result was a case built mostly from fragments, puzzles, missing their most important pieces, names left unspoken, encounters left undescribed. The timeline was known, the pattern was visible, but the final connection, the one that could point to a specific person, remained just out of reach. Times have changed since then. The atmosphere surrounding identity, privacy, and acceptance is different today than it was 50 years ago. But when we look back at this case, we have to remember that decisions made in fear were not made lightly. They were made for survival. They were made because people had to protect their lives as they knew them. And that is one of the most human elements of this story. The understanding that silence can come from courage just as much as from fear. That protecting oneself does not mean one does not care. That a community can carry grief quietly because speaking it aloud was not always safe. As we continue through the story, we will see how time, changing attitudes, and evolving understanding may eventually help bring clarity to a mystery that began in a world very different from the one we know now. As the months turned into years, and the years stretched into decades, the investigation slowly shifted from active pursuit to something quieter, something held in files, memories, and unanswered questions. The case was eventually categorized as a cold case, a term used when all immediate leads have been followed and no new evidence appears to push the investigation forward. But calling a case cold does not mean that it is forgotten. It simply means that time has paused around it. For investigators who worked in the 1970 seconds, there was frustration in knowing that part of the truth was likely known by those who could not safely speak. They were aware that silence had not come from lack of care, but from a world that did not yet make room for certain voices to be heard. And so, the case stayed there unresolved, but never truly at rest. In the background, the story continued to live on in quieter ways, in conversations shared only in private circles, in memories passed down by those who were there, in the evolving identity of San Francisco itself, a city that remembers its tragedies as deeply as it remembers its celebrations. Time can change many things. It changes the way we understand one another. It changes the way we talk about identity, safety, and community. And it changes the environment around old mysteries, creating new possibilities that were not available before. But time can also erase. Witnesses age. Locations change. Objects are lost. And memories, even when held with care, can fade at their edges. What once felt immediate becomes something softer, less defined. That is the challenge of any long-standing, unsolved story. Yet there is something powerful about the fact that this case did not disappear. It was revisited, discussed, re-examined. Researchers, journalists, community members, and later digital historians continued to ask the same questions law enforcement once did. Who was this person? How did they operate unnoticed? Why did they disappear? And is it possible that someone, somewhere, still knows a missing piece of the truth? A cold case is not an ending. It is a pause, a stillness waiting for something to move again. And as time progressed, new tools, new perspectives, and new willingness to speak began to reshape the landscape around the investigation. The story was not finished. It was only waiting. One detail that often surprises people when they learn about this case is that law enforcement did, in fact, identify someone they viewed as a likely suspect. Not officially charged, not publicly named, but closely examined a person of interest whose identity has remained withheld from the public. This individual was questioned. Investigators spoke with him. They looked at his history, his movements, and the ways in which certain details lined up with the accounts given by those who survived encounters with the man later called the Doodler. On paper, many pieces seemed to point in his direction, but an investigation is rarely just a matter of matching patterns. For a case to move forward into formal charges, there must be testimony that can be presented in court, testimony that is clear, consistent, and strong enough to support a legal case. This is where the silence from earlier years became a defining obstacle. Several individuals who might have provided crucial testimony chose not to come forward publicly. Their reasons were understandable and deeply tied to the time period. But without their voices, the evidence remained incomplete. Even with a person of interest identified, investigators could not take the next step. And so, instead of closure, the case entered a kind of suspended state, a space where the possibility of answers existed but could not be reached. The name of the suspect remained inside files, not headlines. The details were reviewed quietly, sometimes revisited, sometimes held in place when no new information appeared. It is important to recognize that the decision not to release the suspect's identity was not about protecting wrongdoing. It was about respecting the limitations of the law. Without strong evidence that could stand in court, publicly naming someone would have risked harming an innocent person. And at the same time, investigators could not simply discard the lead because it was one of the strongest they had. So the case settled into something complicated, a known path that could not be fully walked. This is one of the reasons the story lingers today. It is not just a mystery. It is a reminder of how justice depends not only on what is known, but on what can be said and when it can be said. And over time, as the world changed, the environment surrounding the case changed with it. Silence was no longer the only option. Conversations grew more open. Identity became something that could be spoken instead of hidden. And with that shift came the possibility that new voices or long-held memories might eventually surface. Which leads us to the next part of the story. To understand the depth of this silence, we have to look closely at what it meant to live in that particular moment of history. The 1,970 seconds may appear open and expressive in hindsight, filled with music, art, and movements for personal freedom, but that openness was never evenly shared. For many individuals, especially those in the LGBTQ+ community, privacy was still a shield. Not a preference, but a form of protection. In that era, simply being associated with certain neighborhoods, communities, or social spaces could lead to misunderstanding, exclusion, or worse. Personal identity could affect employment. It could change how family members spoke to one another. It could shape whether someone felt safe walking down their own street. Every interaction held a level of risk that many people today do not have to navigate in the same way. So when investigators reached out to potential witnesses, people who may have spoken with the individual known as the Doodler, or who may have seen him on nights that later became crucial, those witnesses faced an impossible choice. To speak up publicly meant opening their lives to examination. It meant stepping into a spotlight many had spent their entire lives avoiding, and in a time before laws or social protections were firmly in place, they could not be sure they would be supported if they did. The silence was not cowardice. It was survival. Some individuals did share what they knew in private interviews, but without testimony that could be used in court, investigators were limited in what they could do. The case needed voices that could be recorded, challenged, defended, and presented before a judge. And the people who held those voices were living in a world not yet ready to protect them. This is one of the most human and heartbreaking elements of the story. The barrier to justice was not a lack of care or compassion. It was not that people were unwilling to help. It was that the personal cost of helping was too high. They would have had to reveal parts of their lives that society was not yet prepared to accept. Silence became the only way to remain safe. And that silence shaped the outcome of the investigation for decades. But time has a way of shifting perspectives. What once was unspoken can later become shareable. The world changes. People change. And a story that once could not be told may eventually find its voice. The question that remains is whether time has passed just enough, whether the conditions of today may allow truths that were once hidden to finally come forward. After many years of common adder, quiet investigation, something shifted. The world had changed. Conversations about identity were no longer hidden in the shadows, and the city that once hesitated to speak was now willing to look back and ask new questions. With that change came a renewed interest in the case, not only among historians and journalists, but within law enforcement itself. In 2022, and again in 2023, the San Francisco Police Department took a meaningful step. They released a new age progress sketch of the individual believed to be the man known as the Doodler. Using original descriptions, witness reports, and modern forensic illustration methods, they attempted to imagine what he might look like today, decades older, changed by time, but still recognizable in certain features. The release of that updated sketch was not just a technical decision. It was a signal. It said, "We have not forgotten. This story is not closed. Someone still knows something." Police shared the sketch publicly, hoping that the passing of time might make it possible for new voices to come forward. Maybe someone who had once been uncertain felt safer. Now, maybe someone who had held a memory quietly now felt the world was ready to hear it. Time, after all, can do more than fade details. It can also bring courage. The response to the sketch was immediate. News outlets reported it. Community groups discussed it. Online forums analyzed the features, compared them to old records, and worked through theories that had gone unanswered for years. In a way, the sketch breathed life into a story that had seemed suspended. It brought the past closer to the present. But even beyond the sketch itself, the act of releasing it marked a change in tone. The case was no longer being remembered only as a mystery of the past. It was being treated as a story that could still be solved. A story that still mattered to real people, families, communities, and to a city that carries its past openly. The sketch was more than an image. It was an invitation for memory to resurface, for truth to be reconsidered, for silence, long protected, to slowly loosen. And perhaps, if the right person sees it, it could be the spark that finally moves the story forward. Along with the release of the updated sketch, authorities made another decisive move. They increased the reward for information leading to an arrest or conviction. The amount rose significantly, reaching up to $200,000. This was not only a financial incentive, it was a statement of seriousness and commitment. A reward tells the public something very specific. There are still answers out there. Someone knows something, and we are ready to listen. Raising the reward also acknowledged another quiet truth about the case. For decades, the barrier was not simply lack of evidence, it was lack of safety. People were not ready to speak then. But time changes the way we weigh risks. The world now offers more protection than it once did. Conversations about identity are no longer confined to whispers. Support networks exist now in ways they did not before. The increased reward was aimed at this new world, one where someone who once stayed silent might now feel they can finally step forward, not just because of the money, but because the social cost of speaking has changed, because the climate of fear that once defined the silence has shifted. But rewards also carry a different hope, that memories long tucked away may rise again when given space. Perhaps a conversation overheard, a face remembered, a detail tucked into the corners of an old journal. Sometimes the smallest recollection can shift an entire investigation. The announcement received wide media coverage. News stories resurfaced. Old interviews were replayed. People who had never heard of the Doodler before began searching, reading, connecting fragments. Online communities, true crime researchers, archivists, historians started tracing timelines and mapping connections. The story began to move again, slowly but noticeably. Yet, even with new attention, the case did not instantly resolve. Cold cases rarely do. They rely not only on facts, but on timing. The right person needs to hear the right story at the right moment. The hope behind the reward was not to force answers, but to open doors. In a way, the gesture was gentle. If you have carried something quietly all these years, you do not need to carry it alone anymore. The reward is still active. The invitation is still open. And the possibility of someone stepping forward remains. As time moved forward, technology advanced. The tools available to investigators in the 1970 seconds were limited compared to what exists today. Back then, even carefully collected evidence could only be analyzed in ways that now seem incomplete. But science does not stand still. Methods evolve, and with those changes, old cases sometimes find new life. In recent years, investigators began re-examining the physical evidence connected to the Doodler case. They looked carefully at what had been preserved, items gathered from scenes, personal effects, documentation, and records stored in archives. The question was simple, yet hopeful. Is there something here that modern science can see, which the past could not? This is where DNA analysis enters the story. When the case was first investigated, DNA recognition and comparison were not available tools. Today, they are central to identifying individuals in both criminal cases and family lineage studies. Even a small biological trace, if preserved, can become a key. However, the case's age presents challenges. Not all materials remain intact. Not everything collected decades ago was stored in conditions suited for long-term forensic use. And yet, even a partial profile, even a fragment of biological evidence, could offer direction. What makes this particularly meaningful is the rise of forensic genealogy, a method that compares unknown DNA to wide genealogy databases to find familial links. This approach has helped solve several long unsolved cases once believed impossible to resolve. The idea is not to match a name immediately, but to slowly build outward from biological relatives, constructing a family tree that leads to a likely identity. While authorities have not announced a breakthrough using this method in the Doodler case, their willingness to pursue it signals something important. They believe the door is not closed. Investigators have spoken publicly about reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes, and they have collaborated with specialists who were not part of the original investigation. This combination, modern science and new perspective, suggests that the story is no longer just frozen in time, it is quietly moving. The significance here is not only the science itself, it is the idea of renewal. The belief that something once thought silent may still hold a voice. That truth can wait. And sometimes it waits for the world to change enough to hear it. Even with renewed attention, updated sketches, increased rewards, and modern forensic review, the case remains officially unsolved. There has not yet been a public announcement of a breakthrough, no confirmed DNA match, no arrest, no newly revealed testimony. On the surface, it may seem as though the story is still in the same place it has been for decades. But the situation is more complex than it appears. Cold cases rarely move in sudden leaps. They move in slow, careful steps. Investigators gather fragments and revisit old interviews. Journalists uncover forgotten details. Community members share memories that, at one time, felt too risky to voice. Some progress happens quietly and out of public view. And sometimes, one small detail, something almost overlooked, can eventually reshape the entire path forward. The lack of public resolution does not mean the case has stalled. Instead, it reflects the delicate nature of the information involved. If authorities were to announce a lead before it was fully supported, it could jeopardize the integrity of what they are building. Some investigations require silence to grow. It is also possible that the individuals who once held key information are still coming to terms with whether they want to speak or whether they can. The world has changed, yes, but personal history can take longer to unfold. Revealing a memory is not always a matter of timing. Sometimes it is a matter of healing. So the story sits in a space between what is known and what is still possible. The absence of public breakthroughs is not an ending. It is simply a pause, a moment of waiting. The kind of waiting that happens just before something shifts. because the renewed interest, the public conversation, and the effort to humanize the victims rather than sensationalize the case all suggest that we are closer to answers now than at any point in the past. In this way, the case has moved from silence to awareness, from fear to openness, from a forgotten file to a story being actively discussed, studied, and remembered. And sometimes, awareness is the first sign of change. Over time, the story of the Doodler began to reappear in public conversations, not through police reports or courtroom developments, but through culture. Writers, researchers, podcast hosts, filmmakers, and even playwrights found themselves drawn to the unanswered questions and the human silence surrounding the case. This shift matters. When a story enters culture, it becomes part of how we remember, how we reflect, and how we search for meaning in what remains unfinished. And in the case of the Doodler, cultural attention did something the original investigation could not. It created space for empathy, understanding, and awareness. Several podcasts revisited the case, interviewing experts and community members. Articles were written, exploring the social climate of the 1,970 seconds, the challenges faced by the LGBTQ+ community, and how those challenges shaped the investigation. A stage production was created, not to sensationalize the events, but to examine the emotional and personal weight that surrounded them. With each retelling, the tone shifted. The focus moved away from stereotypes, fear, or sensational headlines. Instead, it moved toward recognition of the victims, the survivors, the culture of silence, and the quiet bravery of those who carried truth in private for decades. Cultural attention does not solve cases on its own, but it does something just as important. It keeps the story alive. It ensures that the people affected are not reduced to footnotes. It invites new generations to ask questions that earlier ones could not. It shifts the narrative from mystery to meaning. And perhaps most significantly, it opens the door for conversation in communities that once felt they had to remain silent. Stories, once told only in whispers, now have audiences. People who once carried memories quietly now see that the world may finally be willing to listen with compassion instead of judgment. In this way, the cultural revival of this case is more than storytelling. It is a form of acknowledgement, a way of saying, you were unseen once, you are seen now. And so, we arrive at the present. Nearly 50 years have passed since the events that first brought this case into the quiet corners of San Francisco's history. Yet it has never truly been closed. The file remains active, the questions remain open, and the search in its own careful way continues. Investigators today speak differently about the case than those of the past. The conversations are no longer shaped by secrecy or stigma. They are shaped by compassion, by patience, and by an understanding that time can change the way truth is carried. They recognize that someone, somewhere, may have seen something, heard something, or remembered something that now, after all these years, feels possible to share. There is a quiet hope in that. The city has changed. The world has changed. The fear that once kept voices silent has loosened. People who once hid parts of themselves now live openly, fully, and without apology. The community that once had to protect itself in silence now stands with visibility and strength. And that shift may be the key. Because cold cases are not solved by time alone. They are solved when the world around them becomes ready to hear what was once too difficult to say. Sometimes, an answer waits not for evidence, but for the moment when telling the truth no longer feels like a risk. The Doodler case lives in that space now, in the thin line between memory and revelation. It is possible that someone who remained silent for decades may one day find themselves ready to speak. It is possible that a piece of physical evidence long overlooked will reveal something new under modern analysis. It is possible that an old recollection, once dismissed, will fall into place when viewed from a different angle. The story is not finished. It rests here, between what we know and what we hope to understand. And it asks us to consider something deeper, that every unsolved story is also a story about time, and how time changes us. In the end, the story of the Doodler is not just about an unidentified figure or an unresolved investigation. It is also a reflection of a moment in time, of what it meant to live quietly, to protect oneself, and to navigate a world that did not yet know how to listen. The unanswered questions are real, yes, but so are the lives that were touched, the communities that changed, and the voices that have slowly begun to emerge from years of silence. What remains today is a kind of pause, a space where truth has not yet arrived, but where the world around it has finally become ready to receive it. And perhaps that is the most meaningful shift of all. Time has carried this story forward, not to forget it, but to give it a chance to be understood with more care, more compassion, and more clarity than before. Maybe the answers are still out there. Maybe someone watching this knows a detail they never realized mattered. Or maybe the past will speak when the moment is right. Until then, this case stands as a reminder that history does not always close neatly. Some stories remain open because they are still teaching us how to listen. Thank you for being here, for sitting with this quiet corner of history, and for giving space to the stories that are not always easy to tell. If you would like to continue exploring more mysteries, more untold chapters, or more reflections on the past, feel free to stay, subscribe, or simply return when you are ready. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.